Hello class, this is Mr. DeCoco with video lesson number 20 for Thursday, May 28th. Last lesson we started learning about reform movements. Chapter 14, sections 1 and 2 were about reform. Now, just to recap what reform is, reform means to change things for the better. There was a 40-year time period in the United States where people were looking to improve certain aspects of society. Some of the reform movements, or I should say the major reform movements, was the temperance movement, which was the movement to ban alcoholic beverages. The educational movement, which was a movement to make schools better and to train teachers. There was a movement to help improve treatment of mentally and physically ill in hospitals and institutions. And there was a movement to improve conditions for prisons. The two big reform movements were the abolitionist movement and the women's rights movement. And last lesson, I went over the abolitionist movement and how it actually helped lead to the Underground Railroad. Most of you probably know what that is. You learned about the Underground Railroad in elementary school, and hopefully you know that it's not a train that runs under the ground. That was a code name or code word for a system of escape routes and hiding places that slaves would take to try to escape slavery from the South. Today, I want to focus in on the women's movement, the other big reform movement that wasn't covered last lesson. Many reformers who were involved in the movements I just talked about were actually women. And what started to happen is women realized we're spending all this time and effort to try to free slaves, to try to ban alcohol, to try to make schools better, to try to improve conditions for other people. Why don't we work to improve conditions for us? And that's how the women's rights movement started. Women looked in the mirror and said, we need to make our lives better. Women reformers campaigned for more rights, equal rights, and for fairness. There were several big leaders of the women's rights movement, and they all worked together. One of the earliest leaders was Lucretia Mott. She was a Quaker abolitionist who supported temperance and supported most other reform movements. And she became good friends with another leader, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was also an abolitionist. The two of them met another leader of the women's rights movement. Her name was Susan B. Anthony. Of the three women I just mentioned, Susan B. Anthony might be the most well-known. And the reason why was because Susan B. Anthony was the first to insist that women should get the right to vote. Now, this sounds very basic to us today, but back in the 1840s, this was absolutely radical. Nowhere in the world could women vote. So this was a really, at the time, it seemed like a crazy idea. But as we know, women did eventually get the right to vote. And we'll get back to that in just a minute. These women rights leaders had a meeting. They met at a place called Seneca Falls, which is right here in New York State. They had what was called the Seneca Falls Convention. And at the convention, leaders of the reform movements, mostly women, met and they talked about how to make things better for women. There were about 200 women at this meeting and 40 men. While at the meeting, while at this convention, which lasted multiple days, a Declaration of Sentiments was written, almost like a Declaration of Independence for women, but it wasn't a Declaration of Independence. But there were some things that were similar to the Declaration of Independence. For example, one of the opening statements said, all men and women are created equal, which sounds a lot like the real Declaration of Independence that said all men were created equal. All they did was they added the word women in there. But the Declaration of Sentiments was very important. It did three things. Number one, It stated that there should be no laws that discriminate against women. Number 2, it said women should be able to work male jobs also. And number 3, it said that women should be allowed to vote. It asked for women's suffrage. Suffrage is a word that means the ability to vote. Now, getting back to those 3 things, the reason why they had number 1, no laws discriminating against women, is because a lot of laws were discriminatory against women. For example, in this time period, women could not get divorced. A husband could divorce his wife, but a wife could not divorce her husband. Women also could not own property after getting married. As soon as she got married, all the property, all the stuff she owned became property of her husband. And there were other unfair laws that basically treated women as second-class citizens or worse. Also, women had almost no ability to work back then. In this time period, women had really 2 options for work. One, you could be a teacher and teach elementary school only, or 2, you could be a nurse. And that was about it. Thankfully, today that's not the case. Women work a variety of jobs. Basically, if you can think of the job, women work it. But at this time period, women were not able to hold jobs. And then finally, the right to vote was very, very important. Susan B. Anthony convinced other leaders that nothing would ever change for them unless they had a political voice, unless they had the right to vote. Having the right to vote is very, very important because it gives you a political voice. It allows you to have a say in the laws. It allows you to pick the leaders who make those laws. So without the right to vote, usually things would never get better for a certain group, which is why different groups throughout time, throughout history, not just the United States, but across the world, have fought very hard, sometimes have even had to sacrifice their lives for the right to vote. So within a short time, women in the women's rights movement realized this was the thing they should focus on. They need to get the right to vote. Once they get the right to vote, all the other stuff they're asking for will eventually start to get better. Now, the women's rights movement did have a variety of accomplishments. For example, in education, Emma Willard opened up a school in Troy, New York, called the Troy Female Seminary. It taught girls male subjects. In other words, subjects that people thought that only boys could learn, like math, history, geography, and physics. This school was opened in Troy, New York in 1821, and today it's simply called the Emma Willard School. You may have heard of it. For example, when they have snow day cancellations, you might hear Emma Willard is closed today. Another person, Mary Lyon, she established a school in Massachusetts called the Mount Holyoke Female Seminary. It was one of the first colleges for females, and that was opened in 1837. Accomplishments were made in laws. For example, in New York and 5 other states, women were finally allowed to own property after marriage. In other words, you could get married and your husband didn't get your stuff. You could still keep property and buy property or, not have to give it up. Also, several states allowed women to seek a divorce. And within due time, all states allowed women to seek a divorce. Finally, barriers were broken. That's the last thing I'll mention. A woman named Elizabeth Blackwell would become the first female to get a medical degree. She was the first female doctor in the United States. Maria Mitchell was the first female astronomer, and in 1847 she discovered a comet, which I believe is named for her. You may have heard of Helen Keller. She was a woman who was deaf, blind, and mute. Yet, she learned to read, and she was a reformer herself or worked to help the disabled. And then finally, Mary Ann Shadd Cary was the first African-American woman to earn a law degree. Now, I mentioned the right to vote being very, very important. It would take 72 years for women to get the right to vote. In other words, Seneca Falls Convention was in 1848. But it wasn't until 1920, which is 72 years later, that women finally got the year to vote. And it didn't really just happen all at once. It mostly happened at once. But what happened was some states after the Civil War started allowing women the right to vote. And when one state did it and other states did it, states that didn't have the right to vote sort of said, well, geez, if it works in Wyoming or if it works in Colorado, maybe we should try it. And by the way, in 1869, Wyoming was the first state to allow women the right to vote. In 1893, Colorado allowed it. Then 3 years later, Utah allowed it. Then between 19 and 1918, 3 to 5 other states allowed it, mostly out west. And then finally in 1920, a national amendment was passed to our U.S. Constitution, allowing women to vote anywhere in the United States. In other words, it didn't matter what state you lived in. If you're a U.S. citizen, you can vote. So it took 72 years, but in 1920, that's when women finally got the right to vote. And you'll learn about this in 8th grade. And it was really after 1920 that conditions really started getting better for women. So I guess you can say Susan B. Anthony, she really hit the nail on the head, and she got it right when she said, we really got to work to get the right to vote. Today, women hold any job man does. Today, women are a big part of society, and they have equal rights under the law. And, you know, we see a lot of leaders in our government who are women. They've held every position in government except for president. So, and who knows? In this presidential election, Joe Biden, the Democratic nominee, he says he's going to pick a woman as his vice president. So if he does, and if he wins, we will have a woman vice president, which, by the way, is like having a president on standby in case something happens to the president. So that would be ironic because it was in 1920 that women finally got the right to vote, and this presidential election is in the year 2020. So that would make it 100 years exactly since women got the right to vote that we might possibly have a female vice president. So you could say the women's rights movement was successful. All right, that wraps it up. There are some questions that go along with the material I just presented and pages in the book. So please do the questions. I think there are 4 of them. Watch the video clip that goes along with the Real Women's Rights Movement, and have a good weekend. All right, take care. Bye-bye.